Hey everyone, Derrick Hines here. Welcome to the podcast where I'll share with you the patterns, insights, research, and technologies that we use in my own pain and performance practice to help people improve their health, speed their healing, and increase their longevity. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy it. Good day, my friends. Welcome to the Pain and Performance Podcast. I'm excited to get into this one. Today on the show we had Yogi Aaron, and Aaron has a very interesting path of getting to yoga. And to be completely honest, whenever I first got the request and we were starting to communicate, I was like, do we really need to do a full episode on yoga? But then when you start to hear Yogi Aaron's view of it, is that he's kind of got a contrarian view of what yoga should be and some of the misconceptions around yoga. And so in our kind of communication, I was like, we need to have this conversation. And some of the stuff that we get into are, should you stretch more? If you've ever been told to stretch, this is going to be an interesting conversation. What is healthy muscle engagement, and how does that change our function, and how does that change our health, our body health? We talk about the flexibility versus stability conversation and which one's most important. Is there a path to a better, healthier body through that conversation? We get into some of the best things you can do for like back pain, and we also talk about neck pain and how mobility and muscle activation can help those conditions. So really fun conversation with a very passionate person about movement and physical function. So I think right up the alley of people who are starting to work on, exercise, strength, and we want to make sure that we don't fall off of that because of some sort of an injury. How do we optimize our time working on stability and mobility, which are two of the main buckets that I see people miss all the time. We see a lot of people who come in the office that have good cardio training and good strength training, but that stability and mobility part of physical health gets missed. So we tap on a lot of that in this episode. I think you'll really have a good time listening to Yogi Aaron on this one. So I hope you enjoy it. All right, Yogi Aaron, welcome to the Pain and Performance Podcast, my man.
Thank you, Dr. Derrick. Appreciate being here.
I'm quite excited to have this conversation. I think there is lots of misconceptions around yoga, around stretching, around mobility work these days. One thing I was talking about this morning with one of my patients is that when we don't communicate the whole story with people around these things, and we present something as like, this is it, this is what you got to do, that's what creates distrust around a lot of this stuff. And people have a tough time starting to say like, I just don't know if that's the truth. You're making this sound too good. So what's the downside, right? So tell us a little bit about how you got into kind of sharing the information. Was there some frustrating moments? Was there some stuff that you were like, something's amiss here?
Yeah, I've been into yoga since I was 18 years old. I got into yoga because I wanted to stretch. I was tightening up from all of the exercise, and I was a very active person at that age. And I just kind of thought, well, one of the keys to staying young is to have mobility. And if you actually poll like 1,000 people, probably most of them will say you should stretch to stay young and stretch to stay healthy. So there's this image that people have in their minds that are associated to stretching. Of course, I had it. And the biggest area of my body that was tight was my hamstrings. And I just felt like a limitation in range of motion. So I started stretching, doing yoga to stretch. And it was very much a physical practice at that time. For me, it was really nothing else. But very quickly, I had hurt my back. And over the next, few decades, I ended up experiencing a lot of pain and a lot of chronic pain, like debilitating chronic pain. And what did I do to fix it? Went and stretched. And, of course, I became a yoga teacher, an infamous yoga teacher. I have no shame. And so what was interesting to me, a couple of things before I go on, but what was interesting to me is Not once in all those years did someone ever come and tell me why my muscles were tight and why I was in such chronic pain. And the only answers that I got was, you just need to stretch more. And so I did. Until I ended up in the surgeon's office in an emergency room, and he told me I needed to get a spinal fusion in my lower back. Probably would need to have a spinal fusion in my lower back, and that was sort of a wake up moment. So that kind of forced me to take many steps backwards and ask many questions. What is yoga really about? What do I really want to communicate to people about it? What are the positives? And then start having a conversation with what is, where are we kind of misleading people in the yoga world?
Can we go back a
that's
little
a
bit?
lot to unpack.
Yeah, I'd like to, but because I think there's a lot of people who we hear the word yoga, and yoga is somewhat synonymous with like kind of what you said, stretching. But I think even an image of, this like the yogi. When people hear yoga, you think of like a certain demographic that it's supposed to attract, right?
Yes.
What's the history there? How was yoga like started? What's the progression of that to today?
So that's a great question. So what I'm going to say is my own sort of bias or theory about this. So I just want to kind of stipulate that on the front end. But if yoga was never really a popular thing until about 100 years ago. And there's this man named Krishnamacharya who really brought yoga asana, like postures, is what we think of as postures, to the forefront. And that's a whole history, which I'm not going to get into at this moment, but I want to jump ahead many years forward. And I kind of blame two sort of areas. I blame one person, and then I blame a whole industry for what yoga is. So the person I blame is Jane Fonda. And so what you just said was very apropos, because yoga has a certain stereotype. Women in, tight leotards, leg warmers, and headbands. And so that scares. It's kind of interesting because one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough is, in my opinion, is that yoga was historically, and to some degree still is, but was a men's club. You never saw women practicing yoga. It was like forbidden for a lot of various reasons. And so we just started to see like the rise of women doing yoga. Well, how did that happen? So in the 60s, 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, we started seeing, these kind of crazy sort of yoga studios popping up, heavy incense, a lot of chanting, a lot of woo-woo stuff. Scared a lot of people, but a lot of people wanted to stretch. And so this is the second demographic I blame is, the local YMCAs and fitness clubs, because they started to see people wanting yoga. So they told their aerobics instructors to go and start teaching yoga classes. They had no idea what they're doing. So what did they do? They put on their leotards, their leg warmers, and headbands, came up with a great playlist, and then, taught what they thought was yoga. And we saw that sort of morphing, right to 2000 with Madonna, doing wheel pose and kind of walking across the stage in this yoga pose. And that's kind of like where we think of as yoga. So that's kind of my very quick summarization from Krishnamacharya to Jane Fonda.
That's a great title for this episode. No. Do you think that it was kind of the lazy answer, right? It's like, well, you're having issues, just stretch. Like, oh, well, how do you stretch? I do yoga. Like, it's almost like we were just trying to like pass the buck, for lack of a better term. Like, just go do that stuff. It must be good. People are talking about it's got to be good. What you were talking about, like, what is the good of it? Let's start with that, because there is some good stuff in there. And when you look at research, you do find great things. I have some thoughts around that, but I'd love to get what your view of it is, having kind of come through the whole cycle.
Yeah, sure. I think that so you and I, before the show started, we were having our little pre-show chat. One of the things that we were talking about is the problems that people have with inflammation. And so I think anybody who's in sort of this field can agree that inflammation is a bad thing in the body. And so why does that inflammation happen? So I mean, we can kind of surmise it down to one word, in my opinion: stress. And anytime we have stress, we're going to create an inflammatory response. Stress from life, stress from not sleeping enough. Of course, a big one is stress from food or not digesting your food properly, which then stress also adds, to that problem. So if a person is stressed out and we get them to slow down and breathe deeply, that breathing is going to have a profound impact on the central nervous system. And of course, it's going to begin having an effect on the cycle of inflammation, that inflammatory response. Just as a quick side note, in opening Blue Osa, my yoga retreat in Costa Rica, one of the things that I actually did was I went to the Aveda Beauty School because I wanted to learn sort of more about spa services. And one thing I found really fascinating was a big part of the Aveda system was when you got people in the door and you were about to do the facial and the service and stuff, you do a ritual and get them to breathe because you wanted to start changing or having an effect on that cycle of stress. And so, yeah, the facial feels great, but what they're really doing that feels good is just breathing and letting go and coming to the present moment. And so in yoga, one of the things that is mentioned, like right in the very beginning, like right at Sutra 1, it says yoga is now. And Sutra 2 says, how do we get to now is by basically like the cessation of thoughts, like bringing our thoughts down. We're constantly thinking about so many things. If we can just get our mind pointed to one place, then in Sutra 1.3, it says that we have that feeling, we cultivate that feeling, that reality even, not even a feeling, a reality of becoming at home within ourselves. And again, if you polled like 1,000 people and asked them, do you feel at home within yourself? Probably 90% of them, if not more, would say no. I'm constantly in shock at how many people I speak to who constantly tell me that they do not feel at home in their bodies. And so, once we feel at home, we feel at peace, and that is going to start having an effect on that cycle of stress.
But what a different view of what our intent is, right? Like what you just described to me sounds glorious, to be honest. Like that, I heard someone talk about that, like the last 10 minutes of the yoga class that he was taking was often, kind of going into the meditative state. And his view of it was that he had to go through the physical stuff to get into his body, to get more present, to get into the brain state, to actually get the benefits of that last 10 minutes. But he was like, the whole reason I do it is for those 10 minutes of benefit. But I can't skip to that. I have to go through it to get to that moment. And that's how I prepare for it. And I was like, I've never heard that before. I've never heard anyone go into it with that type of a mindset. It was always exactly what we were talking about. Stretch, do the, work on all of these different things. And I was like, no one has ever said that. And no one's ever made me want to do yoga more than like explaining it that way. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah. So he's talking about the final relaxation. And there's a lot to unpack in what your friend said, that in order for him to feel at home within himself, he has to do, so let's just say it's a 60-minute class. He has to do 50 minutes of a lot of postures, which probably include, some very challenging movement-based stuff to get to that place of peace. And that's great. I mean, that's a good thing, you know, but
I
what
like it.
yoga is actually saying is that we're training ourselves in these practices to be able to drop in at any moment in life and be able to access, one teacher called it the inner kingdom, the inner kingdom. I actually, I don't know how many of you guys are religious that are listening to this podcast, but that's what Jesus taught. Jesus taught, bring your hands together and be able to access that inner kingdom. It's exactly what yoga says. Yoga says that we should be able to access that inner sanctum at any time and be able to commune with the sacred. And so the point is that a good yoga practice is teaching you how to get there at any moment. One of the stories I often tell my students, I do this huge talk on what I was just sharing with you. It's a long talk, but there's one story. I said, a lot of yoga people always say that they need to bang out, that's usually the word that they use, bang out a 90-minute practice that involves a lot of push-ups. We do this half push-up called chaturanga, and they do this series where there's like 50 or 60 or 70 chaturangas. And they need to do this practice for 90 minutes for them to feel that inner peace. And so, one time I was in Colombia and I was coming back to Costa Rica, and the ticket agent turned to me and she said, "You're not allowed to leave Colombia." And it was kind of like, what? So what am I supposed to do? Excuse me a moment. I need to go to Chaturanga Dandasana.
Yeah.
I need to go to half plank so I can just respond to you in a kind way. That's not practical. And this is kind of like yoga is a practice of teaching us how to interface with life and become more effective, to be better versions of ourselves. But it's not saying that you should do chaturanga so you can get to that place. And so that's what a good yoga practice starts to teach you, is that you can access that inner sanctum at any moment. And so a big part of that is learning to train your mind. I always tell my yoga students, forget the bliss. You don't need bliss in your life. There's too many people that are blissed out, Forget the bliss. Learn to concentrate your mind. And this is something that there's never any press about this in yoga classes. You never hear yoga teachers talking about learn to concentrate, learn to focus your mind. That's where the real power is. Because if each of us could actually focus our mind, oh my God, this world would be so different.
Yeah, and I mean, we don't have to completely get off track on that, but that continues to get worse and worse. You look at, like, I was listening to maybe it was a Tim Ferriss podcast, but they were talking about the progression of blogs to podcasts to video to clips to reels to hot takes, and it's like all of this is just one, it's playing on our already diminishing ability to focus, but it's also creating the cycle of an already diminishing ability to focus. And I think, like anything, if you start to go the opposite way of where everything is at, you probably start to separate yourself. And in today's world, if you're doing something that gives you the ability to focus better than others, you're going to have a better experience and a better outcome than a lot of people. When you could take that in any realm, I think, that you want. But I really think that what you just said it's spot on. That would change dramatically. So let's go back, Aaron. Let's take a step back to your experience with back pain. I know a lot of people listening to this will relate to that. What were the questions? You said you had to go back and kind of rethink some things. What were the questions that you asked yourself whenever you kind of left the preceding months and facing surgery, and you've assumingly done what you probably thought was everything right leading up to that?
Yeah, I mean, it just called into question, what don't I know? And so here I am teaching, obviously I'm doing the practice. I'm actually teaching people to stretch, to get rid of pain. I never forget this one girl that came to my teacher training. I think she was 22 at the time. And she was pretty athletic. She liked to run. She really loved to swim. Swimming was her jam. And we started the training, and her back completely went out to the point that 7 days later, she was still unable to move. And that was a sign, on the wall that I should have paid more attention to. That maybe I didn't know all that I thought I knew. And, us yogis, we're really good at covering up our BS. And we do it by saying things like, well, it sounds like you have a lot of emotions stuck in your hips, or you need to release some emotions, or in your lower back. Her dad had actually just passed away about 6 months before that. So, I didn't actually say this to her, but I could just hear, the thoughts like, well, maybe it's her, she's holding on to emotional residue of her dad. Like there's this woman who keeps popping up, unfortunately, on my Facebook feed, her ads. And one of them is like she's crying and letting go. And she goes, this is what happens when you release the hip. Sometimes you feel very emotional. And I was like, we don't actually store emotions in our hips. Like, that's not really a thing. And then she's like, you've got tight hips because your sacral chakra is blocked. So we're really good at inventing a lot of stuff. And it just made me kind of step back and kind of question everything I didn't know. And that actually prompted me to go and study muscle activation technique. I went in to school. There's a guy named Greg Roskopf who started the Muscle Activation Technique School. It's located outside of Denver. And I'd already kind of had a foot in that world already. And one of the things that kind of attracted me to it was getting hands-on into the muscles, how to activate muscles, and then how to test if muscles are weak or strong. That just completely fascinated me. And I started in the lower body program, and within about 2 days, I realized, oh my God, I don't know anything about the human body. And I thought I knew a lot.
Yeah, yeah.
But one thing I wanted to just quickly say is this is important because I think that a lot of people look to spiritual teachers, yoga people, were, for lack of better words, some, kind of spiritual teachers. And we sort of get this carte blanche, like pass on everything. Like everybody thinks that we know everything, and we can kind of make it up if we don't go along. And people are like, oh my God, they're so wise. And nobody ever really questions spiritual teachers. And I think that's a problem, and we need to kind of, self-correct that.
Give us a quick little muscle activation explanation. I know a lot of people on here. I don't know that we've done a full coverage episode
Sure.
on muscle activation, so I think it would be helpful. Like, what is that? What are you doing with it?
Yeah, I love talking about this. So ask me anything. I can talk for hours about this. But so muscle activation is about strengthening, fortifying, reinforcing, whatever word you want to use, activating the neuromuscular connection. So the muscles should be connected to the central nervous system. So if we're walking, if we're moving, if we're in the gym exercising, whatever we're doing, as soon as there's a force being placed on that muscle, i.e., like the muscle is contracting and there's a force being placed upon it, the muscle sends a message to the central nervous system in the form of gamma motor neuron coactivation. Say that 100 times fast. And then the central nervous system sends a message back to the muscle saying contract. So one of the definitions of a healthy muscle or healthy muscle function is a muscle that can contract and contract on demand. Now, muscles have two jobs. I know that they have other jobs, but for the purpose of movement, they have two jobs. They are supposed to move bones and they're supposed to stabilize joints. So going back to our conversation about inflammation earlier, so If they don't move or they don't stabilize joints properly, the result is stress. There's stress being placed on that joint. Now, the result of stress is inflammation. And inflammation actually starts to even disrupt that communication system between the brain and or the central nervous system and the muscles. And it diminishes that gamma motor coactivation thing that's supposed to happen. So in muscle activation, we actually start to reinforce, we reintroduce that gamma motor neuron coactivation. We reinforce that telephone line, that communication system between the brain and the muscles. And the simple way that we do that is basically, the short answer is isometrics. We're shortening the muscle as much as we possibly can. We're holding it for a certain amount of time, and we're repeating that a few times to keep reinforcing that communication system. And our goal is to reinforce it so much that when we do experience stress in life, it doesn't break that communication.
So whenever somebody is doing that, I'm going to use an example because I think it would give us a good jumping off point. I had a patient who has been having some left-sided neck pain, and her initial assumption, she feels a lot of tightness there. Her initial assumption was to stretch it, so she comes in after a couple months, she's been stretching her neck and she's getting quite a bit of pain. When we look at her, her left shoulder blade lays about an inch lower than her right shoulder blade. And your shoulder blade, the spine of the scapula, just for everybody to kind of stay with us, should be, somewhere kind of along the upper back. Let's say T2, T3, somewhere in there. Hers is at like T4. So it's quite a bit lower than what we'd anatomically think is normal. Now, we're all asymmetrical beings, and this doesn't really mean a whole lot. But the fact that she's getting symptoms at the muscle attached to that, and she's been stretching it, means quite a bit to me as a practitioner and looking at that. And it's hard to tell somebody, hey, look, you've probably played into your problem by stretching out what was already an underactive muscle. And now you've allowed those antagonists, the lats, everything that would depress that shoulder blade to really kind of work unchecked. And so now we've got kind of a more significant imbalance in here than we would. And I know it seems strange to tell you to increase the activity in a muscle to help something that feels tight. That's counterintuitive to people. And I almost got like the deer in headlights look with some of that stuff. So when you're using, like in a scenario like that, when you're using muscle activation for something like that, what does it look like in that scenario? Like, what are we mechanically doing with it? And then what's happening inside the body?
Yeah, sure. So you were just saying like one side of her neck was tight. And this is an important point for people to understand, that muscle tightness is a protective mechanism in the body. And I went to see I have a chiropractor, and I see him quite a bit. And one of the things that he was telling me was that I had tightness on my right QL. My right side of my lower back was tight, and he was trying to release it. And I was just thinking in the back of my head, like, well, if that side is tight, what we actually should be doing is activating the opposite muscle. It's tightening up as a response, as a protective response. My lower back, my central nervous system sense that there's instability in my lower back, and so it sends an SOS message: tighten up, tighten up, tighten up, to whatever muscle will tighten up. And so the right side was tightening as a response to the left side not working properly, not engaging properly. And so actually, after I saw him, I've been doing a lot of work to get that side activated and proper, and actually it's fixed the problem. And the same thing with the neck side. Like, if one side of the neck is tight, it's because the other side probably isn't working properly. And so we need to get those muscles activated. I want to just kind of flip back for 1 second. When I was telling you that I started yoga because my hamstrings are tight, that tightness was a protective mechanism. And just to kind of like understand that if you walk on ice, if you go and walk on ice, you step out on ice, you're about to slip, what does your body do? It tightens up. If somebody jumps around the corner and says, boo, what do? You tighten up. And so it's a protective mechanism. And I find it fascinating because in yoga, what are we supposed to be doing? We teach our students to honor their body, to listen to their body, to respect their body. So I think that when we're stretching, it's actually a violation of our body's own protective mechanisms. In the case of my hamstrings, what I really needed to be doing was activating my quads, activating my hip flexors. And not once in 25 years did I ever have a teacher say, Aaron, your hamstrings are tight because your hip flexors aren't working properly. What I needed to be doing is activate my hip flexors. And of course, I still get tight hamstrings. Yesterday, I had a leg day at the gym. This morning, I'm walking around. So I kind of just stopped and I did a really quick hack to activate my hip flexors. Bent over, tightness in my hamstrings disappeared, like that. No stretching involved.
Love it. You'll have to explain that to us in a little bit. So when you're doing, like if we're going through like muscle activation for either one of those things, you said you're using isometrics to turn that back on. What does that do to like the neuromuscular connection in there? What's happening inside during that treatment?
Yeah, so technically what you're doing is when you bring a muscle to a shortened state, actively, not passively, actively. So for example, if I'm lying on my back and I want to release my hamstrings. So you have two options. One is to bring your leg up and grab your leg either with a strap or your hands and pull the leg towards you. Now that's going to start stretching the hamstring, meaning force it to lengthen. And that's actually going to disrupt that telephone line. It will actually cut any kind of proprioception between your brain and the muscle. Now, if you want to get the muscle, your quads working to release the hamstring, you leave your hands to the side and you bring your leg up as much as you can. Now, you're using all of your hip flexor muscles and quad muscles to bring the leg up. And so you're contracting all those muscles. It starts to stimulate the nerve endings where the muscle hits the bone, and it's called the intrafusal muscle fibers. Once that starts to get stimulated, that's what starts to create that gamma motor neuron coactivation and improves it. One of the interesting things, by the way, is when you passively stretch, if I grab the leg and try and pull it towards me, it actually starts to desensitize the communication. It desensitizes and stops that gamma motor neuron coactivation. So you're actually disrupting that communication system. So if I bring the leg up and I hold it there for 6 seconds, and then I just slowly lower the leg back down, I repeat that 6 times, that will start to stimulate those intrafusal muscle fibers to produce that gamma motor neuron coactivation. And that's what starts to get the muscles start working properly.
Do you think there's a time where like the long sustained old school stretch is valuable?
Never.
Not a needed thing.
It's not needed. I mean, if stretching is going to shut muscles down, and we know that, by the way, there's a lot of science around this. Unfortunately, the science doesn't get to become mainstream. But the New York Times wrote an article, or I think it was in 2013 or 14, called Stretching the Truth. You can go and look at it. There's so much data in there that they found that athletes who stretch, their muscles shut down. Now, in that article, it says 30 minutes. So the muscles stop working for 30 minutes. In other articles, I've seen 90 minutes. So, they're somewhere in there. But the interesting and important thing to consider is that those people they were probably doing the studies on were young athletes,
Mhm.
18 years old, 19 years old. So the older we get, the more stress we have, the more inflammation we have, the less likely those muscles are going to turn back on. And so if your muscles are working, why on earth would you want to make them stop working by stretching?
Yeah, are you familiar with cars?
A little bit, not too much. Don't get too
Controlled.
technical on me.
So for everybody listening, cars are controlled articular rotation, and
Oh, okay.
basically what that is where you would take a joint through the furthest ranges of motion that you can do. And so if you're listening to this and you try and like raise your shoulders as high as you possibly can and hold them up there, you're at the highest point. And then you want to take them, you want to stay as high as you can, and you want to go as far back and high as you can and hold
Hmm.
at that point. And then we'll go all the way down as far back and down as you can and hold at that point. And you'll notice you're not doing any weight. There's times where creating these different positions will make you want to cramp up almost. Like
Hmm.
everybody has a different area of the joint motion that is hard for them. For me, when I try and get up and back, a lot of my work's in front of me. So I almost feel like my shoulders want to cramp up when I shorten and retrain that muscle that you can get into this range of motion. This is access for you. And when
Yeah.
we teach patients that, they always say, "This I'm going to be sore after that. Like that was hard."
Hmm.
And then when we talk to them, they're like, "Actually, I felt great. Like, I had very minimal muscle soreness. I felt really good." And I think it's a lot of what you're saying is like we took a muscle that that wasn't working really well, that wasn't turning on and off correctly, that wasn't communicating with the brain correctly, and you
Hmm.
re-educated it for a while. And after that, yeah, you're working that muscle in a way you're not used to, but there's a lot of positive downstream effects from getting all of those systems working well, the brain, the nervous system, the muscle. You can add blood flow and everything else that comes along with that. But it's one of those great examples that when we turn this on in a positive way, you feel really, really good. I'd love to explore that a little bit further and actually give some practical things that you love for people to be able to do. That's one of my favorites. But
I just want to say one thing because what you said, that just simple exercise, that is so great for activating so many muscles that are stabilizing the neck and shoulders. And whenever I go to the gym, I'm going to have a shoulder day today. And so part of my own preparation, of course, I don't stretch. So what I want to do is get the muscles activated and doing shoulder shrugs and bringing the shoulders up. Somewhere along the lines, by the way, we've been told like, having shoulders up is a bad thing. And so you constantly see people trying to force their shoulders down. And because they don't go down, then they try and stretch them, which, completely annihilates them. But as you raise your shoulders, you're actually engaging a lot of muscles. Let's start off with the scalenes, with the upper trapezius muscle, which is constantly tense. So the upper traps, actually, because it's being used so wrong, when we shrug the shoulders, we actually kickstart it to start doing its job properly. So these are great. And the important thing I wanted to enunciate there was two things. One, you're doing an activation. So when you bring the shoulders up, you're doing that as an activation. Just let them drop afterwards. And the second thing, which is really important, is there's 100% accountability. And this is the thing that's really important is like every time we move our bodies in a range of motion, there has to be 100% accountability. You're not forcing the shoulders to go up. You're using your muscles. Your muscles are contracting to lift your shoulders up. You're not having somebody lift your shoulders up beyond in range of motion. Same thing if you bring your arms back. You bring your arms to the sides and then you bring them back as far as you can. You can squeeze your mid traps. Now, you're not having somebody push the arms back. And that's really important. And that's how we start to activate these muscles.
So if you're given, we'll kind of jump into some of these things, and actually let's kind of start with you. What were the things that you started doing for the back when you started learning some of this stuff? What were the moves? What was the activation stuff? If somebody's listening to this and they're like, "Look, I was just told that I might need back surgery, and I
Yeah.
always feel like my hamstrings are tight, my hips are tight." What was the stuff that seemed to help you out of that?
Sure. So what from based upon my own experience and then working with a lot of people, I actually just have a client who started seeing me about 6 months ago, and he's got horrible or had horrible sciatic problems. He came to me. I remember the first time he came to me, was limping in, he was hunched over, and so I got him on the table and I said, "Well, I don't know what I'm going to do today. I mean, I don't know how effective today's treatment is going to be, but it'll be a start and you'll feel some relief." I basically all I did was I worked on his hip flexors, got his hip flexors turned on. Took me a while because he was so inflamed, but it got his hip flexors work. He stood up. Oh, and I worked on some of his. So there's three sets of trunk flexors. I'm telling you this because you're a doctor and you might find this interesting. That always affect the hips, but the big two is the QL. QL is always affecting the hips in some way, and multifidus. So I got some of the trunk flexors working down there. Stood up. He said, "This is the first time I've been pain-free. It's like I don't feel anything in my lower back right now." So for my own journey, the big thing was hip flexors, getting them working. What is the number one hip flexor? The psoas major. And if we look at the psoas major, it attaches right in the lumbar spine. It is actually one of the jobs of the psoas is to maintain that structural integrity of the lordotic curve, that C curve in the lower back. And so anyways, I got that one working. That was a big one, getting my glutes working. I had no strength in my glutes. I always thought being a yoga person, I had a fabulous butt. But which may have been true, I don't know. But I had a glutes that just weren't working at all. And so that was a huge part of it, as well as getting those back extensors working.
Were you doing that, and would somebody do that purely with isometrics? Like, so, like, a lot of people on here have heard, like, stretch the psoas. The psoas is tight.
Yeah.
We got to get that loosened up. If they wanted to kind of try something like this, is it just pulling, not with their hands, pulling their knee deep into flexion, isometrically hold it as, high up as they possibly can? Is that what they're doing with that? Is there some other stuff that they should do to try and get that working better?
Yeah, sure. So number one, please stop stretching your psoas. If your psoas is tight, it's because your glutes aren't working. And that's interesting. The glutes and the psoas are agonist and antagonistic muscles. So if the psoas is tight, it's tightening in response because the glutes are not working properly. So that's number one. Number two, yeah, there's a few ways to engage the psoas. There's a few hacks, but just for your listeners who are listening, there's kind of two hacks that I'll tell you. One is, so what you were saying was kind of interesting. If you're lying on your back, your arms are out like a T, and you're using your muscles to squeeze the knees into your chest. That could be effective. I've actually never tested that to see the efficacy of how much that would work. But what I would suggest is actually bring the knees above your hips. So you're lying on your back. You bring your knees, lift your legs off the floor, bring your knees to your hips, and then bring your hands to your knees. And then use your knees, use the leg muscles to press knees into hands. And that's a great hack. That's one of my favorite hacks because it engages most of the hip flexors and even your trunk flexors. So if you've got back pain, it's usually, not always, but it's a lot of the times it can be directly related to the trunk flexors and hip flexors not working properly. So that's one hack. Another hack to get the psoas working as well as other hip flexors is the one I was describing before. If you're lying on your back, keep the leg as straight as possible and lift the leg up as high as possible and hold it there for 6 seconds and then slowly lower it down. And just do that, 6 times, 6 seconds, 6 times.
Nice.
And there's more specific ones, and I get into that in my book, Stop Stretching, ironically. And so in my book, I get into the different muscles and actually how to engage them individually.
Yeah, one of the things that those things, we're creating an interesting change whenever we look at some of this stuff, and it makes me wonder, where do you see the intersection of stability and flexibility?
So my teacher Greg has a great quote, and he says, if you just have flexibility, you're always going to have instability. So if you just work on lengthening the muscles, you're always going to have stability. And before I finish the quote, I just want to say, come back to something we were talking about earlier, that the definition of muscles, or how muscles work, how muscles function, is they function by shortening, and they have to shorten to stabilize joints and to move bones. So Greg always says, if you just cultivate flexibility, you're always going to have instability, and instability always leads to injury. But when you cultivate stability, you're going to have all the mobility that you want, that you ever need. And the cool thing is, you're not only going to have mobility, but you're going to be pain-free through those different ranges of motion.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things missed in today's like longevity and physical function is stability for the vast majority of the population. And I've said this on here before, but I think when we see somebody and we think that they are like quote unquote getting old, what we see of them is that they are losing stability. They're starting to they're tightening, they're bringing their center of gravity as close in. They're not taking big steps. They're not moving well. And we say, oh, well, they're getting old. And when you look at that, a good story of this, you probably saw it. There was a story of, like, I want to say she was like in her 90s, a yoga teacher somewhere abroad. She was like, and it made rounds. It got really big, and you watched her move. And you were like, oh my gosh, she looks so young. And you were like, well, if you actually just looked at a static picture of her, she didn't look all that young. But the way she moved looked young. The stability that she had that gave her freedom to move outside of that made her look young. And that's such a kind of counterintuitive thing, that the more stability you have, not the tighter you are, the more range of motion you can get into outside of that center of gravity. And that's kind of a strange thing, I think, maybe for people to wrap their head around.
Yeah, and Greg says that age is, there's a lot of truth to the statement, that what you were just saying, that age is defined by our ability to move. And so if we look at older people even like when they get to be 50, a lot of times 45, 50, 55, that they start moving less. They're only able to lift their arm, shoulder high, or they're only able to take smaller steps. Why? Because their bodies are tightening up. Why are their bodies tightening up? It's a protective mechanism. Their bodies no longer feel stable at a greater range of motion. So it says, I'm going to tighten up because I don't want you to go there. And so if we want to be able to go there, we need to get the muscles activated at that joint. Frozen shoulder syndrome usually takes most people a year and a half, sometimes longer, to be able to heal from. And a lot of the prescription is trying to stretch it out. With muscle activation, we can actually heal it. And I've heard some reports where it's like 6 months to, or less, or a little bit more. But a lot of that is just because we're getting the muscles to start working at that joint properly. And so the body goes, oh, it's actually safe to move the shoulder. It's safe to move the arm. I no longer need to go into a protective state. And so if people can understand that tightness is a protective state, we can start to hopefully reframe how we impart wisdom to people, or impart this knowledge to people.
Incredibly valuable understanding. I think changes a lot of what maybe people think that what does it mean when they're feeling something? And
Yeah.
that's a big part of this, right? If we feel that something is tight, our initial response of what we think that means is that we need to stretch it out. And what you're saying is
Yeah.
like, maybe we need to start teaching kids this. What if we actually had physical education? Y'all remember that? Where it actually educated kids on the physical function of their body. But so what do we do with this information though? If we change that and we don't want to be the person who is, having trouble moving, tightening up, getting into this protective state. I know you have the book and you have a lot of great stuff in there, but what are some of the things that people should be practicing today that would help them to like head this off before it starts going down there? For the 50-year-old listening, you're like, hey, here's a couple things you can start doing that will be much more effective.
Yeah, and I mean, I get asked a lot, like if you had one pose to tell people what to do,
How
what
much do
would
you
that
hate that
be?
question?
Well, but the thing is like we have to learn to heal ourselves. And, the solution is never going to be a pill that you take once and it's going to change the course of your life. I mean, maybe there are some pills that do that. I don't know, but but the one pose that I would say, especially if you're just going to do one thing, it's a pose I sometimes call Superman pose. And so you just lie on your stomach, you have your arms down beside your hips, and then you lift your chest and your legs up as high as you can. If you look at the way that most old people walk through life, a lot of them walked hunched over. Why are they hunched? A lot of reasons, but number one is none of their back muscles are working properly. None of the back muscles are shortening properly. And yoga teachers especially, and even movement specialists make the big mistake is in trying to, looking at that older person and go, oh, we need to stretch the chest muscles, which is the absolute worst thing that you can do. The best thing that you can do is start to get them to actively engage those muscles. And if they keep doing that, if you did that 6 seconds for 6 times every day for 30 days, your whole life will be looking very different. I promise you. Unfortunately, I have very few people that have ever actually taken me up on that offer. And, but people that have do report back to me that their whole the way that they relate to pain is completely changed, because when muscles start working properly, tightness starts to disappear in other areas of the body. It's actually with my, of course, I get a lot of muscle activation technique done on me when I get the opportunity. And I was doing this, one therapist was working on me, and there was one thing that we were doing where I was noticing my hamstrings were tight, but he was working on my trunk flexors. And it was interesting to me to notice, like once my abdominals started working and started contracting properly, the tightness in my hamstrings disappeared. And which I just found really fascinating. The body never ceases to amaze me. And so if we can start to just deal with getting muscles working that are inherently weak, and when I say weak, I mean neurologically weak, then a lot of the problems in the body will start disappearing. Again, remember that stress exacerbates muscle tightness. And so if we get muscles working, the stress reduction goes down, therefore inflammation goes down, therefore we become pain-free.
I love it. Yeah, that's powerful. So if people are listening to this, you said a lot of people aren't. All right, listeners, this is the challenge. So if they're going to do it, so let's just, we'll make it very easy. We're going to do Superman. So they're going to lay down once a day.
On their stomach. Yeah.
On their stomach. They're going to come up in the Superman pose, raise the arms, the head, the trunk up.
Keep the arms down beside the hips, because I want to focus on getting into the lower back muscles. Yeah.
And they'll pick the legs up. So your arms is like you're flying without your arms forward. So
yes.
Is there another superhero that does it that way? There's somebody. Anyway. And so they're raising up and holding that position for 6 seconds. Come
Yes.
down off of that, let everything turn off. Do you relax for a second?
Br- Take a breath. Take a
Take a
breath.
breath?
Just relax because the interesting thing about a lot of this work with muscle activation is it happens through the parasympathetic nervous system. It's not a sympathetic response, it's a parasympathetic response. So breathe.
So take a breath and then go back into it 6 seconds and do 6 of those and you're done. That's it.
Yeah, that's it.
Come on, people. We can do this. I will absolutely be joining y'all on it. If you tag myself and Aaron in a picture, we'll give you something amazing. If you're doing this, we'll reach out and we'll hook you up with some goodies if you can tag us in your Superman pose. I would love that. Are you? It's at Yogi Aaron, right?
Yeah, at Yogi underscore Aaron, and on Instagram and then YouTube, it's Yogi Aaron.
So people, obviously, look, I think people, if you're listening to this, and we did a few episodes back, we did like a super deep dive on stretching, going into the science, and a lot of the information that you're saying is exactly what we went through. That what we've thought about these sustained stretches, and what we think about how that relates to pain, the research just does not hold up to that. And I think a lot of people listening to this will want to start looking more at, why am I feeling tightness in my hamstrings or my hips or my chest or my neck and shoulders? As they start to kind of go into this, what other activities do you have your clients or patients build around this type of activity? What are the other kind of lifestyle changes that you find to be super effective at improving not only pain, but function, maybe aging?
Can you be a little bit more specific? Like, are you saying like what do I suggest doing? What do I do to stay young and healthy?
Would love it. Yes.
I for me, a couple of years ago, I was starting to feel guilty because I wasn't working out enough. And so I started doing some research and just like, what can I do that's going to be more active, more daily? Walking. Walking is great. And if you do the muscle activations, if you take even just 5 minutes, do that Superman pose. Do the one that I was saying with the knees coming up over the hips and pressing the knees into the hands. If you do those kind of things and then go for a walk, you're going to get stronger. And here's the thing: if you start an exercise weak, if you start an exercise neurologically weak, and then you do the exercise, you're just going to get weaker. So if you start the exercise strong, you're actually going to get stronger. And that's a really cool thing because you can feel yourself getting stronger over time. Like oh my God, I'm getting more range of motion. I'm feeling like more active. I don't, I went for a walk today for 5 miles and I don't feel any pain in my body. So it's really important to combine these things, these exercises. Just a little quick side note. I used to, as I was telling you, I was dealing with a lot of chronic pain in my early years. Up until that point, I ended up in the surgeon's office. And one of the things I had to do by the age of 30 was hang up my hiking shoes. And there was like a few times when I would go for hikes, but I always like wore these huge braces. So what are braces doing? Well, they're mimicking muscle function. As I got into doing muscle activation, I actually got to the point where I stopped using my brace, and now I don't even have pain in my knees anymore. So we can become pain-free. All we need to do is just get the muscles working. And again, it's just a neurological thing. We just need to stimulate that neurological connection. We do that through muscle activation. Please don't interpret it like, for your listeners, as I'm saying to go and like lift weights or something. Like, that's not actually the wrong thing to do a lot of the times. The right thing to do is just doing simple little, like you were talking about earlier, shoulder shrugs. Like, just get the muscles working properly.
Yeah, I think it goes to show you, there was a good research article that came out maybe in the last 18 months that had two groups of people, and one of them I don't remember them describing it as muscle activation, but basically what they had them do was a maximal contraction of that muscle before the workout. Mm-hmm. and, basically posing in a mirror, right? And then they worked out. And the group that did the activation before they worked out had better muscle development and growth doing the same workout.
Yep.
And it goes to show you what you were saying. Like, if we don't get that neurologically strong before, we're not going to get near the outcome that we want after. So it's a very good way. Don't go the other way. The sequence of these things actually does matter and make a major change in your outcome, your pain, your function, everything you're saying. So I love it. Your information stands up with what my patients see, absolutely, and I think what they can use to improve their health. Where can we find, I know a lot of people are going to want to kind of dig into some more information on some of this stuff. They're going to be trying some things on it. Where can people get in touch with you? I know you put out a ton of information. The book is Stop Stretching. So that will be music to a lot of people's ears. But where can they find you, Aaron? Where can they kind of get more information and get in touch with you, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. Please go to my website, yogiaaron.com. I'm going to ask you to put a link in the show notes, a special link for your listeners so they can access a free practice and begin, getting a solution to whatever pain they're dealing with. They can, choose back pain, knee pain, hip pain, or neck and shoulder pain, as we were just talking about. And I give specific muscle activations. Practices to each of these things. I also get into why they're dealing with pain at that for that specific issue. So that would be the great place to start. And I have a ton of free content out there. People can, just plug in and start living their best pain-free life.
I love it. I do have to ask you, I have a hint of what this answer might be, but we ask all of our guests, if people listening to this can do one single thing today to improve their health, what would that one thing be?
Drink more water and start doing your Superman.
There we go. I love it. I love it. Aaron, thank you so much for what you're doing and what you're putting out in the world. I know you're helping a lot of people and providing them with a voice of reason whenever I think the vast majority of even probably their healthcare practitioners, yes, I'm talking to y'all listening to this, are telling them just, oh, well, you're tight, you just need to stretch more, which they've probably heard, the bulk of their life. So thanks so much for the time and energy that you're putting into helping people improve their health, improve their healing, improve their pain, man. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Derrick, and have a great new year.
Happy New Year, my man. Thank you.